All right, today we're going to be digging into a carburetor on a 2002 Honda Rancher 350. Fairly common four-wheeler around the Midwest. I see a lot of them, and they're coming in for carb cleans because they sit all winter long. A lot of times that fuel in the bottom bowl here will gum up that carburetor. Then you'll end up, your four-wheeler won't start, won't idle well, it won't continue to run, it won't rev up. So several common problems on these. As well as sometimes they just need the needle and seat replaced. So I'll show you how to do that down in the bottom end here. And that is because sometimes that needle gets worn out, sometimes that seat gets worn out, sometimes something gets stuck in there, and I'll show you all those common problems as we work through this carburetor. Obviously, we've got the carburetor off at this time. Typically, you'd have a throttle cable that comes down in here. A lot of times what we do to remove the carburetor from the four-wheeler is go ahead and remove this cover, and then the throttle cable will be underneath here. The other way of doing that is remove the throttle cable off of the actual thumb throttle. You've got to end up stringing that throttle cable through the actual fuel tank area and that cowling there up the handlebars. So that's an option if you feel like you need to replace that throttle cable. You can do that all at the same time. So again, typically you'd have the throttle cable running down in here. You can see it's threaded here, and then that cable is going to wrap around here. It's going to go into that groove there. To remove that cable, what I like to do is push that butterfly all the way open if you can. Sometimes that butterfly is stuck. Again, we'll go through that here in a little bit. But if you can push it open, push it as far up as you can. That way it allows the most amount of slack inside of this housing here. You can take a pick or a flat screwdriver, go underneath the cable here, and then go and slide this cable out from that groove there. So that's going to be how you remove the throttle cable. Then you can just take and thread that out. I believe that's an 8 or a 10 millimeter wrench that you'll use to remove this cable. So pull that out. Then you can set that back down. Here's your idle adjust. Before I forget to tell you that, turning it clockwise, which would be in this case, is going to turn your idle up. Adjusting it out is going to lower your idle and lower your RPM. So you want to start out, I like to keep it just about completely not touching or just about touching, but you don't want to take and just crank on that, do a bunch of turns out, because what that does, you can see, is opens that butterfly. And if you've got your idle turned clear in, your idle screw, you're going to have your butterfly open like that. You're going to be allowing all kinds of air and fuel through there, and you're going to be throwing your carburetor way out of whack because it should not need to be adjusted that far in to idle well. So second thing I want to show you here before we get too far, we've got a hot start here, and this is a mechanism here. It's electronic that actually will warm your carburetor up or warm the fuel up and allow your four-wheeler to start a little bit better. Sometimes it's not a huge, it doesn't make a huge difference, but I've seen where guys will just take and unhook these because they're not necessarily needed. Some models don't even have these, to be honest. So basically what that does is just when you go to start your four-wheeler, allows that fuel to be a little bit warmer, allowing it to flow a little more free. Here's your air fuel screw, and you can adjust that before or while the carburetor is on the four-wheeler. And the way that you do that is you turn it all the way in. That tells you how many turns you were at, and then you adjust it out according to your manual. So typically it's between 2 and 2.5 turns out. So what you would do is just count half, 1.5, 2.5, 3. So this one's 3 turns out. It should typically be 2.5. So half, 1.5, 2, and there's another half there. 2.5 turns out. We won't mess with that again for the duration of this video, but I did want to show you that. Top cap here underneath of this is going to be your diaphragm. You can also test your diaphragm to see if it's good. You can slide it in and out like that. If it slides up and down freely, that's a good thing. If it's stuck, that's not a good thing. You make sure you want to free that up. The other thing that you can do is take compressed air, blow it into this orifice here. As long as that diaphragm is good, that slide will actually slide up. That needle will come up, allowing more fuel to come in. Here's your fuel right here coming into your bottom bowl assembly, and this comes directly from your fuel petcock up at your fuel tank. So you do want to make sure you shut that fuel off before you remove this carburetor off the four-wheeler. Pull the bottom bowl here. I just kind of set that aside there. You take 4 Phillips screws here, and we're going to take and remove those. And again, if you've got this carburetor off, your fuel is probably running all over the place at this point onto the bench. Obviously, we've had ours off. We've drained the fuel, and you can do that with that flat screw there. Just take and turn that out a couple turns. That'll drain the fuel out of your bottom bowl. Keep in mind, if this is still on the four-wheeler and you're doing that, you want to make sure that that fuel petcock is shut off. That way you don't drain the entire tank out onto your four-wheeler there, onto the floor. So shut that fuel off, loosen that little flat screw there, a couple turns. That fuel is going to actually start pouring out this bottom nipple here on your bottom bowl. The other thing that does, okay, so when we got the carburetor sitting here, and obviously it's going to be sitting like this on the four-wheeler, but you're sitting right here like this. If that float is open too far, that's going to allow fuel to dump in. And that fuel is going to come in from your carburetor, or excuse me, come in from your fuel tank here, run into here. If your float is bad, your needle and seat are bad, it's going to cause that to stay open. It's going to allow fuel just to constantly dump into your bottom bowl here. This is your overflow tube. You should be able to, at all times, blow through there freely. So if you put compressed air, blow through that nipple there, air is going to come out here and vice versa. So what that's allowing that to do, rather than that fuel overflow and then end up running straight into your cylinder, that fuel is going to gather in this area here. As soon as it gets past your overflow tube, it's going to start running out your bottom nipple here. So at the beginning of the video, I mentioned a lot of times guys are doing carb cleans because they're constantly having a drip underneath of their four-wheeler, whether it's sitting in the shop, going down the road, riding in the trailer. What that is that float's either getting stuck open or that needle and seat is worn out, and that fuel doesn't shut off when it needs to, is constantly up here, and then it constantly drips out this bottom nipple here. Again, along those same lines, make sure that you've got a hose hook up to this bottom nipple here, because otherwise that fuel is going to be dumping directly onto the crankcase of that four-wheeler. You don't want that fuel doing that. It's going to discolor your motor. It's going to ruin seals. It's going to cause problems, potentially a fire. I've never seen that, but I probably should throw that in there. So make sure you've got a fuel vent hose hooked up here, and that vent hose is just going to run along your crankcase down to the bottom side of your motor there. So basically any fuel while you're riding along, if that carburetor is bouncing around, you're not quite using all that fuel, and that fuel starts to hold right here, it's going to dump out that bottom nipple there instead of just dump straight onto your crankcase. So make sure you've got a hose on there. So setting that aside, now we've got a couple, 3 different jets actually on this carburetor. We've got your main jet here, we've got your pilot jet here, and then we've got a secondary main down here. There's a rubber cap, and that rubber cap just simply pulls off. If you look down in there, you won't actually see a jet down in there, but your jet is on the side here. So we'll get to that here in a little bit, but first I'm going to pull your float here, and then I'm going to pull your needle. So pull that pin out. I just took a screwdriver and just lightly pressed on that pin there, allowed me to get my fingernails on that pin and pull that out. Now you're just able to take and slip that float and that needle up. Now, good thing to inspect here is this needle. You want to make sure there's no grooving in here, make sure there's no burrs or worn areas, make sure there's still a rubber tip on this needle there, and we're going to set that aside. If you buy a carb kit from us or somewhere else, they should be coming with a needle. If they don't, I would return that kit and get one that does. Thing about the Honda carburetors, unfortunately, you can't replace that seat that's pressed in there. Common person, because of it being brass, it's going to be very, very difficult to pull out of there, very difficult to replace. Unfortunately, you've got to replace the entire carburetor. So that being said, check that for wear and tear. Again, you can take compressed air, carbon choke cleaner, and I would suggest you doing this if you're going through and cleaning your carburetor. Dump it into this orifice here or spray it into this orifice here. That's going to shoot out of there. So just watch your eyeballs when you take compressed air, or your kids, whoever's sitting beside you there, because you don't want to spray carbon choke cleaner in here, take compressed air, and blow it out, because it's going to blow all over out that seat there. So next thing, you want to take and pull your main jet, and then you want to pull your pilot jet. Typically, if your four-wheeler is not starting or it's not idling, Most of the time, it is a problem with your idle jet. If your four-wheeler isn't revving up, if you keep giving it gas and it's just cutting out, a lot of times it's going to be your main jet. So this is your main jet here and your main jet holder. I'll try to disconnect the two so you can see it. I've got your main jet holder here, which is this longer tube. You want to make sure that these orifices are cleaned out. You can take a small wire and stick it through those orifices. I've got your main jet here. This particular one is a 128. I'm going to double check that that's what the manual calls for before sending it back with the customer. But that's what your main jet looks like there. I'm going to set it aside so you can take a look at that. And then we also have your main jet holder. Again, both of these, you should be able to hold up to light, blow through, see through, stick something through. If you can't, I would suggest thoroughly cleaning that. Make sure that you can. If you cannot get it cleaned out with blowing through it or a carbon choke cleaner, I suggest replacing that. So next thing is your pilot jet. And again, this is basically it is allowing the fuel from this bottom bowl area up into your engine without you having to give it any gas. So it's going to be your idle. Some people call it an idle jet. It's actually technically called a pilot jet. But again, you want to make sure that this is cleaned out, make sure you can see through it. A lot of times you have to hold this up to light. This is a very, very small orifice on this. This is a 42. So if you can think about the difference there, this is a 128. You can easily see through that. This is a 42. They actually make them even smaller than this and very, very small orifices, which is typically why a lot of guys will come in and have issues with their four-wheeler starting and idling because these orifices are so small. If any amount of fuel gets gummed up in here or a piece of dirt or sand gets gummed up in here, you're gonna plug up that pilot jet and then you're gonna have a hard time getting that four-wheeler to start and run. So, third jet that we have here is your secondary main. This one's a little bit unusual because it comes in from the side. So we're going to go ahead and take that out. It's very, very small, so make sure you keep an eye on that. You don't want this one getting away from you. Once you get that jet pulled out, same thing. You want to be able to look and see through it. This is an 80 secondary main. So basically that is a little bit, it's kind of in between these for size. You're not going to get those mixed up, different thread size. You're not going to put the wrong one in the wrong place. But you just keep that in mind. 80, 128, and 42 is what we've got on this four-wheeler. Now we're done in the bottom end. What I suggest doing is taking compressed air, blowing through all of these orifices and taking carbon choke cleaner and blow through these. Before you do take and blow through anything, especially that main jet area, we're going to take and flip this carburetor over. We're going to pull the diaphragm and the needle, because what I don't want you to do is take compressed air, blow through the main jet there, and then damage your diaphragm or your needle or your slide. So again, 4 screws from the top here. These are a little bit smaller, and you don't have to go Hulk mode on these. These are very, very fine thread. They're very short, and there's no reason, because of a rubber seal, you don't need to go Hulk mode on here. Typically these don't really just loosen up for no reason. Snug them up, that's as good as you need to do. We take and put all of our carburetors through ultrasonic cleaners. I'd highly recommend doing something like that. I'll put you a link down in the description below for the ultrasonic cleaner that we like to use. Also, the carbon choke cleaner that we'd like to use. So I'll put those links below. Pulling this cap here very carefully, it is spring loaded. Take and pull that spring out. There's your cap there. Set that aside. Now we've got your diaphragm. If this slide or diaphragm is stuck, you don't want to just take and stick your screwdriver in there and pry it. You don't want to damage this venturi here. You also don't want to damage your slide. On this particular model, it's plastic. I don't love that idea, but it is. And so pulling it out of there sometimes can be difficult if it is stuck. And a lot of times you can take and clean these up really well. I use some real fine emery cloth. Clean that up if I need be, or you can just use carbon choke cleaner. What you don't want to do is get that carbon choke cleaner on the rubber diaphragm portion of this. It's either going to stretch out, it's going to rip, make it dry it out, it's going to make it really thin and flexible, and you're going to have issues potentially down the road. So don't get carbon choke cleaner on there, but if you need to, put some on a rag, wipe it down. Also wipe that needle down. The other thing that you can do on this particular model, you can take a small pair of pliers and push it down, or go down in there and grab that clip. This one, you are able just to take and push that spring out. That's what holds the needle on. Then we've got your needle here. This one's adjustable. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes you got to have a lot of times you got to have a specific size. So just make sure that you go in with the right size needle. This particular one's got a washer underneath of it. It's set at the middle setting. So for the altitude and riding conditions that we're in here, this one's set correctly. But again, check your manual to see what riding altitude your needle should be set at. If you've got performance parts done to the four-wheeler, also keep that in mind. You may end up changing that needle size. So sticking our holder back down in there, I like to just drop it in there. Then I take a small screwdriver actually and just push that down into place. This is what holds that needle, the only thing that holds that needle in. So if you do something wrong here, you give it gas, you're gonna end up shooting that needle up into this slide area, and then your four-wheeler is not gonna run right at all. And so just keep that in mind if you've got issues there. Okay, a couple things here while we're here. We've got your choke assembly, which is here. We've already pulled that off. It's got typically a cap on here with a plunger with a cable running down through it, and that's removed obviously at this time back on the four-wheeler. Just want to be careful going on and off with that that plastic cap there. That's your choke assembly. So a lot of times what happens, we've got an orifice running through here and then right here. So you've got air flowing through here. When you've got that choke pulled, it's going to allow more air through there, pulling up more fuel. The other thing that I wanted to point out in this area is when I told you earlier that you could blow compressed air through this somewhat half moon type deal here, you actually would be blowing air into this portion of it, which is why that diaphragm and slide raises as you blow air through there. Going back together then, I like to take and set our diaphragm in this position, take and drop it down in there. Again, there's a little tab there. You line that up with that tab. Take and turn it and drop it. You want to make sure that it goes down into that main jet area. So I wanted to show you one other thing too before I put that slide back in. So when you go to give it gas, when you go to give your four-wheeler gas, this butterfly is going to open up. You can see it from this side. That butterfly opens up, allowing more air through there. More air through here means more air through this half moon deal here. Pulls your diaphragm up, pulls that needle up out of the main jet holder in that main jet area, which is here, and allowing more fuel to get sucked up into your engine. So if you take and put a larger orifice main jet on here, or you change the height of your needle, so say you raise it up, when you give it gas, again, butterfly open, more air flowing through there, the higher the slide is going to go, meaning the higher the needle is going to go, the more fuel is going to be sucked up through that main jet. So again, bigger main jet, more fuel through there, smaller main jet, less fuel through there. That's why it's important. Any performance parts done or different riding altitude, you want to make sure that those things are accounted for when you're putting in a needle or a main jet. So going back together now, after that little lesson there, we're going to take and drop this, slide down. Again, make sure that needle falls into place there, and make sure that tab is in the right place. Make sure that's seated properly. Now, if you've got a new diaphragm, a lot of times what happens is these are more flexible, a little thicker when you get them. If you set them in a windowsill, set them in the sun, make sure that you, that'll allow that to suck out that moisture, or any reason that diaphragm has expanded. A lot of times that'll shrink down enough to get it into place there. You do want to make sure that that is in the groove. Make sure that your cap sits down there without any issues. If that is pinched at all or it's not sitting down there properly, you're going to have some serious issues when it comes time to start your four-wheeler. So put these Phillips back in. All right, we've got all of those on now. Now we can flip the carburetor upside down and we're gonna start putting jets in here. This secondary main's a little tricky just because it's coming in from the side. It's a little bit hard to hold that. Sometimes I use pliers to hold it. Sometimes you're able to use your fingers, but sorry, you're not gonna be able to see anything going on here because of how small this jet is. To get that lined up and started, you can take your screwdriver, run it in there. These are brass jets, so you just wanna be careful you don't damage these. Make sure your screwdriver's in place before taking and really turning on it. That way it doesn't damage it. So your main jet there, and then before we forget, we want to take and stick that rubber plug in there. Set that down. We can tighten up both of these. Again, same thing. If you've got too small of a screwdriver and you put it in there and turn it, and it actually turns inside of that larger hole there, you're gonna damage the jet. You're gonna detour that fuel from flowing properly. So you just wanna make sure that you don't damage that jet when going back together. Run that pilot jet down. These are brass jets, like I said, and they're going into an aluminum carburetor. So same thing, you don't really have to crank on them. Again, you wanna make sure though that they're snug enough that they're not gonna come undone. I've seen that before. Guys get their four-wheeler back in, that main jet or pilot jet runs itself back out. So typically you'd send it with your customer and it ends up not running right when they get it home and start using it. So you just want to make sure that those jets are snugged up, but not incredibly tight. Don't damage the top of the jets. Okay, your needle here in your seat, drop that down into place, and then you're going to take your pin and run it through those holes. If this pin is stuck, what you don't want to do when pulling this apart is take a hammer and a pick and just start pounding on it. What that is going to do is going to break the post off, and you're going to have to replace your carburetor. There's no fixing that after you do that. Little test that you can do here. I like to put my mouth on that tab there. It's gonna run down. You're gonna take and shut that float, shut that needle, and make sure that you cannot blow through that orifice. I don't like to use compressed air because you can't really control how much air is going through there. You don't really know if it's stopped or not. So I don't know if you can see it here. There is literally no air coming out when you just shut that float there. So essentially the same thing. That fuel is gonna be running in there. It's gonna fill it up. That float, because it's hollow, because it floats, is gonna go up and it's gonna shut that fuel off. As you use the fuel, it's gonna drop back down. Then fuel is gonna flow into that bottom bowl there. Then it's going to dump more fuel into your bottom bowl. So that is Carburetor Floats 101. Take your cap here, or your bottom bowl. Make sure that this O-ring is good. Make sure it's been replaced if you put a rebuild kit together. Make sure there's nothing sitting down in this bottom bowl here, because what happens is if you've got some sand or some dirt down in this bottom bowl and you start the four-wheeler, that fuel is gonna slosh that dirt around. It's gonna take and actually suck it up through these jets. If you've got small pieces of sand, it's gonna lodge in that pilot jet. If you've got larger pieces, it's probably gonna lodge in your main jet. So make sure that's all cleaned out. Use carbon choke cleaner and compressed air. Make sure that's all cleaned out really well. Take and put this cap on the right direction here. Slide it into place. Again, making sure that that seal is in place. So a lot of times what I'll do is actually tip that carburetor this way. That way I don't have to tip that O-ring upside down. And then once I get it into place, there's grooves that carburetor will sit that you typically you cannot move it back and forth this way once it's in place. And I like to keep pressure on there until I get these screws snugged in. That way that O-ring stays in place. That way that bowl doesn't shift. So snugging these up here. All right. After those are snugged up, your carburetor should be ready to go back together again. Sometimes what guys do is take and they'll spray carbon choke cleaner over this whole thing. Again, I don't like doing that because you've got rubber hoses here. Typically the hoses aren't going to get damaged because a lot of times they'll withstand fuel, but what can't withstand the carbon choke cleaner is this diaphragm. So if you do end up doing that, I like to do that first after I pulled the diaphragm and before I've pulled the bottom bowl. That way you can kind of get that dirt off of there. The other thing that you can do is take compressed air, blow that all off of there. A lot of times that loose dirt and debris then will come off, and you don't have to even worry about carbon choke cleaner across the whole thing. So that's a carburetor on a 2002 Honda Rancher 350. If you guys got questions or comments, make sure and leave those below. If this video has been helpful, make sure you give us a thumbs up. That will allow us to continue to shoot these videos and help you guys out. Thank you guys for watching.